Well, I've had a wonderful time. Slept very well and got to see my son, future daughter-in-law this morning. I'll be glad when they get married so I can just call her my daughter-in-law instead of future daughter-in-law. It's so awkward. Well, this morning I want to talk about spiritual aliveness. And the first thing I want to say is that while most all religions claim to value spiritual aliveness and growth, they also fear it. Because when we become spiritually alive, we begin to challenge not only cultural structures and priorities, we also challenge religious structures and priorities when we become spiritually alive. There is never a social reformation or revolution that doesn't include some dimension of religious reformation or revolution. Religions, like every other institution, resist change. So even as we in the church claim to welcome aliveness and growth, we also fear it and resist it. Always remember that the historical figures we now venerate as prophets were, while they were alive, despised as heretical. Efforts were made to constrain and limit their insights and discourage their vision. The church has been a bit like God in the book of Job, who said to the ocean, "Thus far you shall come and no further." The church has been a bit like that. The church welcomes spiritual aliveness to a degree, then attempts to repress it. Every church, every religion does this. Indeed, it is the great irony of religion that it fears the very thing it should be encouraging. Time and again it has said to seekers and prophets, "This far you shall come, but no further, no further." Last year I wrote a letter to the editor of Quaker Life magazine, it's our denominational magazine, questioning its silence on the issue of marriage equality. They had dedicated an entire issue of Quaker Life to the topic of equality, listing all of the work that they were doing in this area, without once in that issue mentioning the most pressing equality issue of our day, marriage equality for gays and lesbians. I wrote a letter to the editor about that and received a phone call from a prominent Quaker who was near the top of the food chain, who wanted to meet with me and asked me to retract my letter about marriage equality, that people weren't ready for it, she said. People aren't ready for it. I said, well, gays and lesbians are ready for it, and they're people. How long do you want us to wait? How long do you want us to wait? And she said, well, I think our friends in Africa will be ready in about 50 years. And she was very serious. I said, well, I'm going to be dead in 50 years. But it's this far you shall go and no further. So there's this reining in. When I became a Quaker minister 33 years ago, I spent 2 years at a church as a youth pastor, following the customary pattern of putting the most inexperienced people in charge of its most vulnerable members. And so there I was. So I worked with teenagers, and I enjoyed it. I had fun. And then I was called into my superintendent's office, and he said, I'm going to give you your first congregation. And I was so excited. He said, let them get to know you. Tell them what you believe. Work with them. Don't insist they change. Just let them get to know you. And I had been studying theology at college. I was very eager to articulate some of the things I had learned about. So on my second Sunday there, I mentioned in my message that I did not believe in hell, which was a theological position the organist on loan from the Southern Baptist didn't appreciate. And she got home from meeting for worship. She called the elders and she said, "It's him or me, take your pick." Well, they had spent 6 months looking for an organist and only 1 week looking for a pastor. So it was easy to see which way the wind was blowing. When I arrived at the meeting house the next Sunday, the elders, I still remember, were lined up outside the meeting house door waiting for me. And they said, "We need you to do something before meeting for worship." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And they said, "We need you to go to the organist and tell her you believe in hell." I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to lie." And they said, "Well, then you're fired. We're going to have to let you go." My wife hadn't yet come in. I went back out to the car. She said, "What did they say?" I said, "Well, good news and bad news. The good news is we get to sleep in next Sunday. The bad news is I've lasted less than 3 weeks on my first church. They fired me." And a month or so after that, I was hired by another Quaker meeting, and I was there for 4 years. And when I left that church, I believed in hell. Oh, I believed. I was a believer. You ever been to a church like that? Yeah. This is all to say, I'm going to shed this outer garment here. This is all to say that if we begin to take seriously the notions of spiritual aliveness and growth and moral evolution, we will be at risk. But we will also feel fully alive. I've been fired twice in my life, once from that church and another time from an evangelical publisher. And there is no more exciting feeling in the world than being fired. I could say with John Newton, the composer of Amazing Grace, "I once was bound, but now I'm free." It is pure exhilaration. There is an aliveness to it that is breathtaking. And that is what spirituality is, after all, aliveness. The word spirit in Hebrew, ruah, means life breath. Ruah is that vital principle or animating force within living beings. So to say one is spiritual is to say one is animated. One is fully alive. We might even say super alive. To be spiritual is to possess this quality of super aliveness, this awakened state. And I think people who are spiritual radiate this aliveness. And people who are really alive, because there are degrees to aliveness, we know from our own experience that sometimes we feel more alive than others. Sometimes it takes a little more effort to be alive. Of course, none of us are super alive in all areas of our lives, in all areas of our being, but we can be really alive in one area of our lives or in several different areas. And I think this is where Jesus, this is how I'm beginning to understand Jesus, apart from the divine language that we've heaped on him and piled on him all over the centuries. That what made Jesus distinct was that he was fully alive in all areas of his life. Maybe why that's when people looked at him, they said, and this is Dominic Crossan, that if God were ever to take on human flesh, Jesus is what it would look like. This quality of super aliveness. And maybe that's how the doctrine of Jesus' divinity got started. People didn't know how else to explain his super aliveness, this animating force and power within him. Now, here's the thing about people who are fully alive, who are super alive. This is what I've noticed about them. Their aliveness is a challenge to our aliveness. And we all know that. I'm sure you've experienced that in the presence, whenever you're around someone who is fully alive, who is super alive, that you too have a way of coming alive, of becoming more animated. There is something radiating, there is something challenging, there is something that echoes within us, and that was true of Jesus, and it has been true of other people. In my book, The Evolution of Faith, I called these kind of people God-bearers, kind of resurrecting a Catholic term I was taught about Mary, Theotokos, the God-bearer. Marcus Borg calls these people spirit people. They are a challenge to the spirituality of those they meet. We can't ignore them, try as we might. And if we're around them long enough, one of two things happen. When we begin to be around the super alive people long enough, one of two things happen. Either their super aliveness makes us alive, or their aliveness reveals our brokenness. And we will kill them, or silence them, or ignore them, or cast them out from us. Now, I don't think when I was fired it was because I was super alive. I think it was because I was annoying. But I do think when the prophets were killed, and Jesus was crucified, and Gandhi was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was shot, it was because their super aliveness challenged people who could not bear the challenge. Their aliveness took them past established boundaries. We had said, "This far ye shall go and no further." And they swept past those boundaries like waves in the ocean, and we resented that and feared that, and so silenced them. This is one response to people who are super alive. We silence them, we fear them. I want you to think for a moment about the people in your lives you have met who have this quality of super aliveness. Maybe you were related to them. Maybe they were a teacher. People who are spiritually awakened. In fact, I want you to think now of someone like that, a super alive person you have known. Just think. And you might even mention that person's name to someone next to you. Go ahead and do that if you feel free. Just turn to the person next to you and mention that person's name and describe what it was about that super alive person you admired. Maybe describe one or two of their traits. Now, I can't know for certain because I don't know all the people you mentioned or thought of, but I suspect one trait, at least one trait they held in common was wholeness. There was a unity and integration about them Their actions reflect their beliefs. If you were to listen to these people talk, you would discover their manner of living is consistent with their ultimate values, so that there was a real joining together of what they professed and how they lived, and that those ultimate values affirmed and promoted life, not diminished life. In fact, we discover when we encounter someone who is whole and integrated that we want to be like them. Have you noticed that? When you were thinking of that person who was super alive, that you've often thought to yourself, when I get older, or when I'm more mature, as I mature, I want to be like them. We long to be like them. We sense that wholeness is the one thing we most lack. So much so that we could say that our spiritual quest in life, our goal, our dream, our hope, is this quest for wholeness. The great mythologist Joseph Campbell talks about this, that our great quest is the quest for wholeness, because aliveness and wholeness are synonymous. Indeed, our quest for wholeness is probably what brought us here today. We desire to be whole people. And because I think this is because we sense within ourselves, I shouldn't presume to speak for you, so I'll speak for myself and say, because I sense within myself a spiritual split-mindedness. The Benedictine monk, Brother David Stendhal-Rost, who's just wonderful, nearing the end of his life, says our human problem is that we are spiritually schizophrenic. Now, the word schizophrenia literally means split mind. And if we are honest, we recognize this split-mindedness. It is a great problem, which we also realize. And so we have this quest, this longing in our lives for wholeness. David Stendhal-Rost had studied the work of the British anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who had done some early work on the origins of schizophrenia in humans. And while Bateson's work on schizophrenia as an explanation of human schizophrenia has been largely rejected, I do think it has something to offer when we begin to talk and think about spiritual or institutional schizophrenia, specifically the split-mindedness of the church. Perhaps when we talk about that, Bateson's theory is helpful. Bear with me for a minute while I flesh this out. Gregory Bateson had a very interesting theory about the childhood setting in which schizophrenia was most likely to occur. And he had 4 points about that, of what he called the double bind theory. First, let me ask if there are any psychiatrists or psychologists in the... Okay. If I get this wrong, please don't point it out. But he had 4 points of what he called the double bind theory. And he said when these 4 points are found, the incidence of schizophrenia increases. I want to use Stendhal-Rost's words here because they're just very succinct and to the point. The first point, Rost wrote, is a deep bonding with the significant other, usually the mother. So there's the child and the mother, and that deep bonding, that deep belonging, that sense of unity is there, that deep relationship. Now keep in mind that we're not talking about the church, okay? Second point, the child now gets from the significant other double messages. That's the decisive point. The mother will say, "You know that I love you." Well, that's a double message, you see. Here's another. Relax. I told you relax. If that happens day after day in many different ways, and the child, and this is the third point, the child has no way of clarifying his or her confusion, has no way of saying, now wait a minute, you say one thing and you do another thing. Why is this? If you're reflective, you can ask why. You can bring this out in the open, but most children aren't reflective. They don't have the distance to even ask, don't have the reflective power about this situation. The child cannot ask. That's the third point. And the fourth point is this. The child can't get out of it. If you remove the child from that situation, well, of course, the danger of schizophrenia is minimized, but the child can't get out. If that bonding is there, that's where he or she belongs, then the child gets the double message and has no way of clarifying the situation. And as I said, though we've now found Bateson's theory to be unhelpful in understanding human schizophrenia, I believe it certainly helps us understand religious or spiritual or institutional schizophrenia. So let's look at our situation with regard to Mother Church. We have this deep bonding, most of us, you see. And if you don't have this deep bonding with the church, all right, your danger of schizophrenia is minimized. But if you have this deep bonding with the church, and I know many of you do, and I certainly have that deep bonding. I'm a pastor, for crying out loud. Nothing is going to get me out of that, and the same is true for many of you. You have a deep connection, a deep bonding with the church, and couldn't totally leave it even if you wanted to. I mean, you could physically leave it. You could say no more, and you could physically leave it, and some have. But that doesn't mean that it stops informing and shaping your life. And so we've got this double message. Because the church, which is supposed to nurture us, often behaves like the worst stereotype of a father. Strict, law and order, and conformity. Shape up or ship out. God loves you, but you're going to hell. Do you hear that double message? That double message. Absolutely all the worst stereotypes of a father. Now, my father wasn't like that. I hope your father wasn't like that, but that is the stereotype of the father. It's a false stereotype of the father, but it's there. So we have this mother community that acts like the worst stereotype of the father. So there's this double message. Law and order. Be silent. Conformity. Don't talk about gay people. Straighten up. If you're going to live in this house, you must obey. So what do people do? Well, the only way out is to leave. And millions have done that. Millions have done that. But just because you've left something externally doesn't mean we've left it internally. Besides, leaving the church isn't an option for many of us, so we have only one other option, and that is this: the option of questioning authority. Questioning authority. Respectfully, but clearly and firmly, which leads not only to our individual wholeness and integration, but the wholeness and integration and super aliveness of the church. Therefore, I would contend that the friends of the church are not those who obey it with grudging silence. The friends of the church are those who question it with courage, dignity, and integrity. Clearly question it. Here's an example of this. In the late 1980s, and I keep talking about the issue of homosexuality because for my generation, that has been the issue. In the late 1980s, when the Quakers in Indiana would assemble at our annual meeting to discuss business, the talk would often turn to homosexuality because several of our meetings were starting to perform same-gender marriages then. And invariably, someone during the course of those meetings would say something hateful about gays or lesbians, maybe referred to them as an abomination or something such as that. You've heard the language. When that would happen, an elderly man present would simply stand up. He would stand up and remain standing quietly with his hands folded just like this. And at first we couldn't figure out what he was doing. But after a while, we put two and two together and figured out that he was standing whenever anyone made a hateful comment about gay people. He never said a word. He never said a word. He just quietly stood until the day's business was concluded, and it drove people nuts. But something began to happen. People became more careful, more loving with their language, because if we didn't, we knew he would stand up. And we realized that his presence, his super aliveness would be a challenge to our brokenness. Now, who was a true friend to the church in that moment? Those who tried to silence critique, who were obedient, who went along, or the man who stood whenever he heard the church give a double message, whenever he heard a church who purported to love being hateful? Who was being spiritually alive? The man quietly standing, or those in the church insisting on obedience? Now I want to talk for a bit about what creates this kind of spiritual aliveness. And I want to do that by talking about what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called peak experiences. That's probably a familiar term to many of you. In his book, Toward a Psychology of Being, Abraham Maslow defined peak experiences this way. He said, think of the most wonderful experience of your life. Just go ahead and do that. Think of the most wonderful experience of your life. The happiest moments, ecstatic moments, moments of rapture, perhaps from being in love or from listening to music or suddenly being hit by a book or painting, or from some creative moment. As Maslow noted, peak experiences are usually momentary experiences, transcendent, elevated experience, a moment of vision, like when you're up on a peak and you can see far in the distance. This peak experience makes you feel as if the world is one, that the world is united, and you're right in the middle of it. Peak experiences make us feel fully alive. I remember my first peak experience. I was 24 years old. I was married, just recently married, going to college, and my wife and I were broke. We were just out of money. College was so expensive, and I was very discouraged. I had 8 years of college in front of me. My wife had just lost her job. I had quit my job to attend college, and I had no idea how it would all work out. One winter day, I was driving home in my Volkswagen, which didn't have a reverse gear, so I had to park it on an incline whenever I parked so that I could roll backwards if it was necessary. I was driving home from school, and my car broke down on the interstate. This was back in the days before cell phones, and no one was stopping to help. It was a gray winter day. And for the first several moments, I was just filled with this deep despair and anxiety. Cars were whizzing by, no one was stopping. And as I sat in my car, unexpectedly, this great peace settled over me as if I were flooded, just flooded by grace, immersed in it. And I felt in that moment deeply loved and cherished by God. And not only loved by God, I felt loved by all the world. And the people driving by me, it was as if they were in slow motion. As they passed, I could see their faces and felt this extraordinarily deep love for them, love for all the people driving past me. I felt as if everyone in the world had entered into my suffering and anxiety and were a part of it with me. And it filled me with this sense of deep peace and solidarity and even elation. Now here's where it gets interesting. Prior to that experience, I had been a Christian fundamentalist. I'd been Catholic, came into a youth group that was decidedly evangelical, and began reading the Bible, and fell under the sway of some people who I worked with who were fundamentalists, and like them, I became a fundamentalist. That was the direction I was headed. I had carefully divided the world into the saved and the damned. Christians like me were saved. Everyone else was lost. I was very certain of that. But in that moment, my view of God and the world changed. I knew God loved everyone. I knew God was unswervingly committed to the well-being of all people everywhere. I knew nothing could separate us from the love of God. I wasn't sure what term to apply to that view. Later on, I would hear someone else describe that view and call it universalism. So I thought, I must be a universalist. And that's when I stopped believing in hell and got fired. But back to Maslow. Maslow was curious about why some people seemed so fully alive, so super alive. Rather than studying people who were broken and who were obviously mentally unwell, he began to study people who were well and asked, what makes them well? What makes them this well? And he began to talk with them. And he noticed this. He noticed that those who were especially alive were the people who let their lives be energized and informed by their peak experience. So as I said, rather than researching people who seemed unwell, he decided to study people who seemed well and engaged and alive. And in his research, Maslow discovered that these were the people who lived at a higher level of consciousness, who were super alive, who had had peak experiences. And when he would describe what a peak experience was like, most every one of these people would say, oh, sure, I know what you mean. I had that happen too. I had something similar happen to me. But the people who were the most alive, the people who were the most spiritually whole and what I would call soul awakened, and this is important, the people who were most alive were the people who allowed the energy of their peak experiences to flow into every aspect and moment of their lives. They never forgot it. They are the ones that acknowledge those peak experiences and say yes to them. Others might say, oh, that was a moment of insanity or something like that. But Maslow suggests that is the moment when we are most sane, when we are most well. It is the peak of our aliveness, the peak of our awareness, and those people who let the energy of that experience inform their lives are the people who are most alive. And also the people who let that peak experience inform, not only energize their lives, but inform their lives, and they remember the lesson of that peak experience. The ones who remember the lesson of that peak experience are the ones who are most alive. Now, I want us to pause for a moment. And I want you to think of a peak experience you might have had. A moment of deep elation, of deep peace. Think of that moment. Try to recall if you've ever had such a moment. If you haven't had one yet or don't remember it, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean God doesn't like you. It just means that maybe you can't remember it or that you haven't had one yet, but you're not dead, so there's still time. Don't worry about it. It isn't to make you anxious. So try to think of that moment. Now I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to do what Quakers do now. I'm going to ask queries. I'm going to ask questions. I want you to think about that peak experience. I'm going to ask you this. How did you feel at the moment of your peak experience? Think about that. How did you feel at the moment of your peak experience? Now, there will be many answers to that question, but one common answer is this. That I bet most of you felt a sense of deep belonging. A sense of deep belonging. Most of the time, we go around as if we are orphans, as if we are outsiders, left out, not quite there. But for that one moment, you really belonged. You belonged to yourself. You belong to all others. And not only to all other people, you sensed in that moment that you belong to all creation, to all plants, to rocks, to the sky and the clouds. It's a sense of deep unity, a limitless unity. You belong. And you belong in every respect. And in that moment, you begin to understand that our whole religious quest is a quest for that belonging. And to have that belonging is ultimate bliss. It's what Joseph Campbell called it, bliss. And Campbell said then, to be spiritually alive then is to follow our bliss. You've been given that taste of your bliss in that peak experience. It is the moment when you find yourself, when you find your life, and when you say, that's it. That's it. That's what you should have in your peak moments. You should say, that's it. David Stendhal-Ross said the Bible began with a peak experience. When God brought Eve to Adam, and Adam said, that's it. Remember, God had paraded all of those animals before him, and Adam had named each one, you see. And naming in the Bible means, I've got your number, you are this, and you are this, and you are this. But then comes Eve, and Adam says, I'll never get her number. That's it. That's it. The mystery. We become spiritually alive when we find that moment, when we said, that's it. And that's what aliveness is. That is when we feel most connected, most a part of things. And that is spiritual aliveness. And this always means change. It always means change. Change for us. Change for the church, and we know this is painful. We know change is painful, which is why the church always says, this far ye shall go, and no further. It can't bear the pain of it, you see. But if we can question their authority, if we can live out of the energy and wisdom of our peak experiences, we can evolve and we can grow, and our souls will awaken. And when we evolve and grow, when our souls awaken, we will help the church evolve and grow. We will help our families evolve and grow. We will help, finally, this broken world evolve and grow. Now, I should have a really good closing illustration here, and I don't. So I'm just going to open it up to conversation and ask for your feedback and attempt to answer any questions you might have. I am curious about this whole notion of peak experiences, and I don't mean to put anyone on the place, but did you have any specific questions about that or any memories of one yourself? Yes. Mm-hmm. And I all of a sudden realized that the first tree was it was like I was just surrounded by it. Wow. Yeah. In my talking about peak experiences with people, I'm often surprised at how it's tied up to creation. Yeah. And how the more culture tries to separate itself from creation, the more broken we become. Yeah. Questions, observations. And I'll repeat your question. Could a peak experience be called a miracle? I will say this. I have spoken with people who have had peak experiences, and they have often used words like, I felt as if life were a miracle. I appreciated how life was a miracle. It felt miraculous. So that is a synonym I often hear associated with that. So I wouldn't stand here and say, no, they're two different things. I think they might be first cousins. Yeah. Yeah. In that, both miracles and peak experiences transcend our understanding. Yes, sir.
Got a good question.
Okay.
Okay. It was easy for the person to stand up when someone said something about gay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What if you're in with a group, and I believe in the world should be taking care of it, but you don't ever hear anything from up there, from the pastor? Do I stand up the whole service?
Well, I would say that your responsibility is to live up to the light you've been given. And that you must create opportunities to speak. See, this whole idea of the person in the pulpit being the only one with the voice is alien to me now as a Quaker. Since when I speak at my meeting, it's followed by a period of about 20 to 30 minutes of silence. And during those times, I am often rebutted. I'm challenged about something I said. So there is a mechanism present in the meeting for worship itself for rebuttal, addition, reflection. And if that isn't built into the worship, I don't know what you do. I do know people who just bring it up. They bring it up in Sunday school classes. They ask to meet with their pastor and talk. I think the worst thing is being silent. Yeah. That's why I think questioning authority, that got a bad rep in the 60s and 70s, is actually vital for a healthy community. It has to happen. It has to happen. For any institution to grow and for people to grow, It has to happen. Yeah.
Phil, I have a quick question, kind of a,
Mm-hmm.
not so much a rebuttal, but a clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Your example of a peak experience reminds me of what called the Damascus Road experience.
Oh, that was clearly a peak experience, I think, yeah.
However,
Mm-hmm.
many people either can't remember, don't recall, or don't have that, and therefore feel like they're left out of the conversation.
Right.
Which I always think is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think more clarity to this peak experience or using other language perhaps would be more readable to people. Because if they're looking for that aha moment, that may be elusive, and I would venture to say that many don't have that, but certainly can feel a sense of spirituality.
I think this is where recovered memory might be useful, because I would bet that everyone in this room has had a peak experience and that it was dismissed as in his research, Maslow found that people who were unwell dismissed their peak experience, couldn't reclaim it, couldn't remember it, and that his therapy began with the effort to help them remember it, to recall the energy and insight they had in that moment, and then to live out of that. And so he began to use other synonyms. Miracle, I think, might have been one of them. Feelings of elation, asking them, tell me a time when you felt deeply loved, or have you ever experienced what you thought was God? And so he would ask these series of questions, and as people began to reflect and remember their spiritual lives, he began to help them see, this has happened to you. And so I would contend that I bet everybody in here has had a peak experience. They just didn't know what to call it. They were perhaps maybe frightened about it. They felt like they were losing their mind. But Stender Ross says, no, that's when you're most sane. And I would say it's far more common than we realize. Yeah.
Just a follow-up comment to that, you mentioned, recovering your peak experiences in a sort of retrospective way. But something that I have found to be extremely helpful is to notice in the present and being present. And Mary Oliver has a wonderful short poem, about 5 lines that I cannot recite, I wish I could, that talks about noticing in the present. And I think when you try to do that, you find not necessarily peak experiences, but small peaks every step of the way.
Yes, yeah.
To follow up on that, on the peak experience that you had that you just described for us, how did you, if you did, sustain that? How did it make you alive later, years later?
It still enlivens me when I get in moments of anxiety. And in that moment, I described it as just being full of this dread and anxiety. So today, when I revisit those emotions of fear, anxiety, mostly as a parent now, because my life is, the major questions I'm dealing with and have somehow managed to arrive at some clarity. But anxiety around my children, I remember my peak experience, and I say to myself, the fears you dreaded, the things you dreaded, did not materialize. And should they materialize, you are surrounded by a world that is a good world, that has wonderful people in it who will be present in your life, who will help you through this. And so I just, because my peak experience had to do with this sense of belonging and being cared for. Almost like I imagine if infants had, if children in the womb had the ability to reflect, would feel like when they were in the womb, everything I need is taken care of. I am warm and safe here. So I just remember that peak experiences, and I've had other peak experiences in my life. And I just, so when I start to feel, this lack of integration, I just stop, and I try to remember what my peak experiences have taught me. It's almost always been the same message. You are cared for. You are loved. Don't be anxious. Yeah.
A brief question. How often would you say that guilt might be associated as a follow-up feeling to a peak experience?
I wouldn't call it guilt. I would call it a recognition of brokenness, and then the response to me that seems appropriate to that is gratefulness for that insight, so that I'm not bludgeoning myself or someone else, but that I'm grateful for that insight of where the fractures lie within me, and commit myself anew to the unity, realizing that this is the point of life. That this is the point of life. This effort toward unity and integration. It's the point of life. It's more important than how much money we have. It's more important than where we live. It's the point of life.
The reason why I asked that is one of my big experiences had to do with something that happened very terrible to another person important to me. But out of that terrible experience came a big experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I felt almost simultaneously this peak experience and follow-up sense of guilt. That it's only through that person's suffering that I got to experience the peak experience.
I would say, thank God you were open to learning from what was otherwise a wretched experience. I've often learned things at the expense of other people's suffering. And I hope people learn things when I'm suffering and look and say, boy, I don't want to do that. And so our suffering in that sense is a gift we give others. It becomes an object lesson and shouldn't be avoided. I think that's another reason we're so psychotic sometimes, is our efforts to avoid suffering. It just causes so much trouble. Yeah. We have a question here and then a question there. Do we have a question here? Yes.
It's not so much a question, but I will share something that I've always thought of as an epiphany more than a peak experience, because and I've had peak experiences certainly that I would consider peak in the sense that you've described, but something happened that I've never forgotten. I don't ever speak about it, so this is brave for me to talk about something kind of intimate, but when my mother passed away in 1999, and my family and I had always traveled to the Midwest to be with her and my dad and my family for Thanksgiving. And this was the first Thanksgiving that I had been at home. We were home we live in Roswell. And I remember being busy in the kitchen and doing what my mother always did and helping out and having people do things for me in the kitchen and help out. And all of a sudden I had this incredible feeling that I had to escape the kitchen. I just had to get out of there. It was so sad. I was very despondent. I was having a hard time accepting my mother's death. And I went outside. It was a very dreary day. It had been raining off and on. There was no sunshine. It just really described my mood. So I went outside, sat on the ground, looking over. We have a pond behind our house. And I was just weeping and missing my mother. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I felt this incredible light, and I looked up, and on the pond was, if you've ever looked at light on in water, you can see it shimmering like thousands of diamonds everywhere. And I felt transported. I felt as if I weren't even in my own environment. And at that moment, the sun burst out. This light played on the water, just shimmering everywhere, coming closer and closer to me. I was about 20 feet away from the shore. And I had this innate knowledge that those diamond-like sparkles represented everyone I had ever known who had died. I had the feeling that their souls were dancing on the water. And I had the most euphoric feeling sweep over me and felt embraced by all of that, not just the nature part of it, but I knew that God was everywhere and in me. And I felt loved, and I felt like this gigantic hug swept over me.
Exactly.
And I was alive.
Yeah.
Totally alive again. And after a few minutes, it sort of went away, but I had this knowledge that my mother was safe wherever her spirit was, along with my dad and all the other people that I had known who had passed away. They all flashed through my memory in an instant.
Yep.
And I went back into the house and was able to be happy, deep down happy. So to me, that was an epiphany, but I think in your description, it was probably one of those peaks
Absolutely.
that took me out of myself
And of
and
course-
brought me back to myself.
We can only know if your mother is safe if she believed in the infallible scripture. And
My mother was a questioning person, too.
and isn't that where the distinctions about who is saved and who is
Yes,
not become
absolutely.
absolutely ridiculous?
Yeah,
Yeah, we just transcend all that. Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that no longer, and that's the biggest thing I've noticed with former fundamentalists. If you give me a former fundamentalist, I can point to someone who's had a peak experience and remembers it, because that almost always leads us out of that rigid religiosity. If we let it, if we pay careful attention to it, I've never seen anybody have a peak experience and become a fundamentalist. I've never seen it happen. I've never seen it happen. And I've been pastoring 33 years. I've always seen just the opposite, that people are rigid and hidebound as I was. They have a peak experience that just blows the doors off of their understanding, and they move out of it. And it is fearful, it is scary, but it is also electrifying and euphoric.
Yeah, I was never a fundamentalist, by the way.
Now, the key thing for you will be to remember that as you're dying. My mother and father are both in the process of dying now. They're both in a nursing home. They're in their last years, probably in their last months. It's been a very hard winter for them. My mother is accepting that, welcomes visits, likes to reflect and talk. My father is dreading it and is very frightened. And so my work with each one is kind of different. And my conversation with each one is different because of where they are. And I keep trying to get Dad to remember a peak experience because, as I said, I think everyone's had them. I just think my dad has forgotten his. And that if he could remember it, all of the fear and anxiety he has about what his future holds would dissipate. But my father isn't given to self-reflection, and so it's very difficult for him. My mother is given to self-reflection, and so it's a process that she welcomes. And so hold on to that memory, because you will be cognizant of your dying, and it will be of great peace to you. The diamonds on the water. Yeah. It is a gift. It's a huge gift. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a quick question. Can you have a peak experience in a dream?
Oh, certainly. And nobody's ever asked me that before, but yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's what dreams, maybe that's, yeah.
I had a profound dream where I returned to my hometown, and I was driving. I'd been visiting old friends, and I was driving back to my home, and the sun was hitting my eyes to the point where I had to close my eyes, and I couldn't open my eyes. They were stuck shut. And I was driving, and I was terrified that I was going to plow into somebody. And I pull over into someone's driveway, and this elderly lady came up to me, and it just imbued warmth and kindness, and she said, "Don't worry, dear, everything will be okay."
Huh.
And then that's when I woke up. And I remember that every time I'm in a situation where I'm anxious about things.
Yeah.
But it was such a profound feeling of warmth and love and caring, and I knew that what she was saying was true, that everything would be okay.
Well, and there is some evidence in the Bible, when we read our religious tradition, that what God could not teach us in our waking moments, God taught us in our moments of slumber. So though I have never thought about that relationship, I would certainly say, oh gosh, yeah, dreams can be a powerful conveyance of that. Yes. And then
I had an experience in the past when I would see an automobile accident, I would get very nervous. But over the years, I have run across 2 automobile accidents where people were trapped in the car. And immediately, without thinking, I went over to each car and helped pull the individuals out of the car, which was very much unlike my experience in the past. And what I realized was that a tremendous amount of calm and compassion and quietness had come over me. And when I walked away, I couldn't believe that I was the same person.
Yeah. And maybe you were a part of someone else's peak experience in that moment. And years later they said, it was weird. I had this car wreck and this man came up. I'd never seen him before. And he pulled me out and then walked away. I've never seen him since. But it was wonderful. So maybe, I always thought that would be the best thing in the world, to not only have a peak experience, but to be a part of someone else's peak experience. Would just be such an honor. That'd just be wonderful. Yeah. Yes, a question here and then here, friend.
Several years ago, I read some information around the science of collective consciousness of the human race. And they had done some research that big events, that they could see an uptick, whatever the monitoring system that they used, they could see an uptick in the collective consciousness of the human race. And I don't know how they did it, but anyway. One of the things that I noticed, and one of the times that they talked about it, is there was actually a precursor or an uptick of the collective consciousness right before 9/11. They could actually measure it on their computers that there was an uptick. The interesting thing about that is, as I don't know about other folks, I was living in Atlanta at the time. That day after 9/11, there was a peak experience in many of us, I believe, as we traveled to our jobs and things like that, because there seemed to be this overwhelming love of people letting people in, you know, when they're driving, and this courtesy that simply didn't happen.
Right.
And it was almost as if we were all experiencing that love and care that we suddenly felt for each other.
Yes.
In a very different way.
Yeah. I know the night after Donald Trump won the presidency, the Sunday after, many people in my meeting came to meeting just weighed down. And I knew that would happen because that's how I felt. Not so much because I didn't like or not like Donald Trump. I didn't like the appeal that was being made to us to support that kind of thinking. And then I got to thinking as I was writing my message about it, because you got to talk about it if you're a pastor in a faith community. You can't show up and preach about Hezekiah. You've got to talk about this. It's on everyone's minds. And I remember just feeling elated because I knew that because of that election, others would be inspired to do all they could to better the world, to make sure that the fear and the isolation behind that message would not prevail. And I've seen it borne out. The people in my meeting have, and I've seen this, and I've talked with other pastors about this across the religious spectrum, are engaging life and service in a way I have never seen. And which makes me think that in our efforts to have peak experiences, we do all these things to create worlds where nothing bad ever happens, and that is a fallacy and it doesn't work. It is the challenges that we face that tend to create the peak experiences as we rise to the occasion and as we define within ourselves what kind of people we will be. I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, and we'll take a couple more questions and we'll take a break.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there's a widespread desire amongst many, many people for peak experiences. And for all too many people, they find that the best way to induce that is through drugs and alcohol.
Right.
And right now in small town America that you write about, there's a major addiction crisis.
Yes.
Because people are using drugs to get what they perceive as a peak experience. And the fact that these areas are supposed to be, so religious, that it kind of is an indictment of the religion in those areas that they're seeking their peak experiences from drugs rather than anything the church can give them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I mean, my father's an alcoholic, and I have a nephew who's on drugs. And when I look at them, I think to myself, they are two men in search of meaning, in search of wholeness, using the only tools they have. And it's, it's a challenge. I mean, it's just an incredible challenge.
I mean, when you had your peak experience, it just happened out of the blue. It was like grace.
Yeah.
Descending. Many people don't want to wait for that.
Yeah.
They want it now.
Yeah.
They can get it from powder that they buy from somebody down the street.
And I tell you, when I was 20, my best friend was killed by a drunken driver. And I was just devastated. He'd been my best friend since first grade. We were riding motorcycles. A drunk driver came over a hill and killed him. If I had had access to drugs, I would have taken them because my existential pain was so deep and the church I was at wasn't addressing it. They just said, these things happen. Well, I know that. Yeah. Come be with me. But I got through that, without doing that. But, I tend not to get mad at people who take drugs. I tend to look at them and look at my dad and say, what is that deep longing that they've just never been able to meet any other way? Yeah.
Nobody's ever taught them a better way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes, friend.
This comes under the heading of advice from a Quaker, and I'm going to ask you, especially in the current atmosphere, but this was going on forever and has since the human race began. What do you do if you're in a group socially or just a group of people and the energy turns negative, people start talking about other people not there? Do you just let it go on? Do you change the subject? What do you do?
I remember what David Stendhal Ross said about Gregory Bateson's work. You challenge authority. You do that clearly. I use humor because no one likes to have a finger in their face. So I use humor. We built a new meeting house. A man in our meeting who gave half the money for it, gave $600,000 for it, pulled me aside on the day we were breaking ground. He had not yet given the money, and said, implicit in my gift is the understanding that there will never be a same-gender marriage performed in this meeting room, in this meeting house. I said, okay, what would you suggest? He said, same-gender marriages can be done, but they must be done in the old meeting house. And I said, that's a wonderful idea. I said, just like when we made the blacks sit in the balcony at the movie theater. And he knew immediately what I meant. And he stopped. And he said, that's not going to work, is it? I said, no, it's not going to work. But if I had said to him, that's unacceptable, he would have. And I want to be the first to say that I don't often have those moments. I have a lot of moments when I wish I would have said something, but that was one of those rare moments, and I think it was just a gift, that comparison of blacks in the balcony, gays in the old meeting house that we didn't love anymore, that wasn't a part of our lives anymore, sidelined them, just came to me, and I said it, and he got it, and was thankfully mature enough. So humor works. What doesn't work is not to say something. It's just to not, we just can't be quiet about it. We have to speak.
Okay, so what do you do on all those other times when it doesn't come to you in that moment?
Well, there's a sweet woman in our meeting who just reaches out and takes that person by the hand and smiles and says, oh, honey, I don't think that way at all. And you know, it always works. She has the kindest smile. She just takes them by the hand and says, oh, honey, I don't think that way at all. And it really works. It works. I think that's an advantage of age, incidentally. A 20-year-old can't pull that off. A 65, 70-year-old, oh, honey, I don't think that way at all. We can pull that off. One more question.
As a leader of Sunday school group, an adult Sunday school group, I went back and said that the pastor told me that the New Testament was a series of stories about a man who had peak experiences. And his peak experiences aren't our peak experiences, but they are a way of looking at a response that we should take to having them, that goes beyond killing and silencing, that goes beyond leaving, and actually has to do with the challenge of facing our church and facing our own brokenness.
Yeah.
As this week comes up, you know.
Yeah.
Something about, I got the question, the church.
Did you write that? Can I steal that?
Sure. but it's harder for me to deal with the exposure of that man's own brokenness and coming to grips with that, especially this week. That man was also broken and had to face his own brokenness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful way to end this. I hope you're not expecting an answer from me. They can't fire you, you know. They never hired you.